listening to Awake in Relationship, a podcast about intimacy, community, and culture in a time of great change, with Silas Rose.
Hello, my name is Silas Rose. This is episode 7 of Awake in Relationship. So in these times of social distancing, many of us have extra time to reflect on and contemplate aloneness, which is why I feel this following story and interview is very timely. For over 7 years, a most remarkable lone wolf named TAKAYA survived and thrived in a small group of islands about 2 miles from downtown Victoria. His life and story of resilience was captured by Cheryl Alexander, a renowned international conservation photographer and educator living in Victoria BC. Sadly, through a series of events, which we'll go into in this episode, TAKAYA was shot and killed in March just outside Shawnigan Lake. For many of us living on the West Coast, and actually people all around the world who have connected with TAKAYA through Cheryl's photos, this was a huge loss. In this episode, we're going to be chatting with Cheryl about her unique relationship with TAKAYA, cultivated over 6 years. We'll also talk about his legacy going forward. So before beginning this interview, I thought I'd play one of TAKAYA's lonely howls. So Cheryl, thank you for joining me this morning.
With my pleasure.
So, you've kind of traveled the world and seen some very kind of remote and rare places. And I'm kind of wondering what kind of first caught your attention with TAKAYA?
Oh, well, you're right. I have been really fortunate in my life to have traveled, lived in different countries. I have lived on a sailboat for large portions of a number of years, and we've traveled to places and lived in places like Panama and Colombia and Cuba, and seen amazing areas. But I live in Victoria, and it is my home, and I have always loved the landscape that we have here and the sea. I'm very connected to the sea. My family were seafarers in the early days of both on the East Coast in Newfoundland and also in the early days of the West Coast. My great-grandfather was the first coastal pilot on the BC coast. And so I think inherently, I feel very connected to the sea. In the sea close to me are these islands, and I have been visiting them for about over a period of 40 years, and have always felt very drawn to them, that they're a special place and that they have a certain spiritual quality to them. So when a wolf showed up there about 8 years ago now, I was quite fascinated initially just by the thought that there should be a wolf on these islands. They're very small, they're very close to the city, and it just was a really unusual event.
Yeah, well, I'm wondering actually, for those that are not familiar with TAKAYA, I wonder if you can just give a little bit of history and background. How did he end up on this island, and tell us a little about his environment.
He swam to the islands, but don't really know why. About 8 years ago, people spotted what they thought initially was a stray dog, or a dog that someone had left out there. He was quite skinny at that point, and probably a young dispersing wolf. They tend to disperse from their pack and look for new territory when they're between 2 and 3 years old. So he probably left his home and was seeking territory. And for some reason, he ended up coming right through the outskirts and the suburban areas of Victoria and ended up swimming over to this group of islands. He then stayed there for about 3 months. The odd thing about it as a habitat for wolves is that there are absolutely no deer or any other ungulates or large mammals that he would actually typically eat as prey. So the fact that he stayed there for a while was interesting. He actually then left about 3 months after he arrived in the islands, and he swam to Trial Island. And he swam, that's about 5 nautical miles away. He was spotted by the lighthouse keeper there, getting out in the island. And then it looked like he was going to continue on and swim down the Strait of Juan de Fuca. He started off and he encountered a giant fish boat bearing down on him, and it probably scared him. He turned around, swam back to Trial Island, and then back to Chatham Discovery Islands, where he then stayed for the next 8 years.
I'm really curious about his name.
Well, when I started to get interested in him, seriously interested in him about 2 years after he appeared there. I didn't see him for a long time. And, you know, I'd never really known much about wolves before. I was much more interested in whales and sea life. But after I saw him and began to be interested in learning about his life out there, I wanted to call him something other than just the wolf. And I just started looking around on the internet actually to see what were the various names for wolf in other languages. And Takaya came up as the Coast Salish word for wolf. And then I had heard that the local people, the Songhees, had called the wolf Takaya, which is their Lekwungen dialectic name for wolf. The Coast Salish is the more general term. And they had called the wolf Takaya, and thinking it was a female. Until I was involved, most people assumed that the wolf was a female for some reason. And I have also been very connected to Japan, to practicing Aikido, martial arts. And I also found that Takaya was a really interesting name in Japanese. It means honored one. And so it just seemed to me like a really great fit for him. He looked like a strong name. Takaya seemed like a strong name. And so it just was my name for him. It really had nothing to do with what anyone else called him. That was just happened to be what I chose.
He's such a charismatic animal, and you can really see it in his eyes. Tell us about your first meeting.
My first meeting actually did not involve looking into his eyes. I was actually just drifting through the waterway there in the boat with my husband and a daughter and a friend. We were just enjoying the sun setting, and I just glanced behind me and I saw where the channel we had just come through. I just saw him getting out of the water onto this small beach. And I just went, oh my God, there's the wolf. And my husband to that point hadn't really totally believed there was a wolf on the island. And so he sort of laughed at me and said, oh yeah, right. And the wolf disappeared very quickly behind the trees. And then he started to howl. And he just howled and howled these incredibly long, melodic, mournful sounding howls. And it was very, very moving. It just was, it actually hit into the core of me somewhere. And, you know, to the point of feeling tearful. And he then stopped. And that was my very first encounter. It wasn't until the next encounter that I actually looked into his eyes, and he kept eye contact with me. And it was a very powerful experience. And that was the moment I feel like I was really captured by his life and the essence of who this being was.
Yeah, well, I really get a sense of that from particularly from watching the documentary on the nature of things, about this kind of very powerful relationship that you had with Takaya. I'm just kind of curious how that really kind of evolved over time.
It evolved very slowly. I felt this intense connection. I didn't really understand it, where it came from, and I began to just have a lot of questions about his life. I
Mm.
thought about him in relation to other wolves and what I knew about wolves, which was that they're pack animals, yet he was alone out there. And by this point, had been alone for 2 years. And I had an experience actually up in a bit more north up in the island in Desolation Sound, and I encountered 3 wolves that were part of a pack, and 2 of the wolves were separated from the young one, and they ended up joining back together at the end of the day, and they had this incredible romping and this joyous greeting, and then they all 3 sat and howled looking across at where I was. They sat on a bluff, and I just it struck me that he did not have this. Like, he didn't have companionship, and he didn't have what he had no one, nothing to even touch him, like no other creature. And it was very odd for a wolf. So I just realized I wanted to understand him more and to learn about his life out there. And no one else was. I had contacted a professor at UVic who studied wolves, but he didn't know anything about the wolf at that point and had never been out to the islands. And I just thought, you know what, he's living this remarkable life. And so I just started taking photos, and I would see him periodically. And the more I got to know about him, the more interested I became, and the more mysterious his life was. And also I just felt a growing connection with him.
I'm just curious about how frequently did you visit him?
Oh, it really varied because, as I said, we were, for those first few years, we were still living 3, 4 months on our sailboat. So when I was in town, I would go out sometimes a few times a week, or then there would be a couple weeks where I wouldn't go out. It was really varied. I mean, I had a life. I have 3 daughters, and I have 3 grandchildren, and I was working on all kinds of other things as well. So I just went out when I could, and I found it a very for me, it was a place where it was almost like a meditation. It
Mhm.
was a place that I could be quiet. I was mostly by myself. I was mostly on my boat, and he would be nearby, but never particularly close. Occasionally that would happen, but it was really just a presence. And I think he may have benefited from my presence there as well as me from his.
Mhm. Well, I think in many ways you were his companion.
Yeah, I imagine, he was comfortable with me. Um, People have said, oh, wasn't he habituated to people? And I said, well, he actually was used to people, because it wasn't just me. There are people that come and go in those islands all the time. There are kayakers, there are people hiking in the park, there's small boat operators, there's whale watchers that come through trying to see him. So he had to figure out how to live in a world where people came and went. And he had done that really well. He just sort of accepted people's presence, but he didn't approach people. He didn't interact with people to any negative degree. So
Mm.
he just kind of figured it out for himself.
So one of the things that really drew me in was his story of kind of resilience. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, in terms of, how he survived so well on that island.
Yeah, he was a wild animal who chose a territory for himself that he could survive in. He learned how to hunt what he needed to hunt out there, which was seal. That was what he had accessible to him primarily. and he learned how to deal with limited water supply. He had a certain intelligence that, to me, when I observed him, seemed like he accepted the limitations of his environment and had figured out how to look after himself. He was independent, and he had a resilience in that he was able to adapt to a very unusual set of circumstances for a wolf. And I think this resilience actually really helped him to thrive, because he never to me seemed anxious or unhappy with where he was at. He was almost, he had a Zen presence, and I think you may have experienced that looking into his eyes in the film.
Mm-hmm.
That was very real. He was grounded in a way that that for me, it was a very inspirational way to see an animal in their environment where they were at home. Mm-hmm. And it was his place. You know, he was pretty in control, and he was the king of the islands. And he just kind of went with the flow, with what was happening.
Yeah, well, again, I mentioned the eye just because they're so penetrating. You know, all animals have intelligence, obviously, but there was something, I guess I would describe as wise in those eyes.
Yeah, there for me, there was a wisdom in his eyes. He was a personality. He had a character. He conveyed something when he looked at you. And it's interesting because often he would not look directly at me. Mm-hmm. He would look a little ways off to the side. Sometimes he would make eye contact, but mostly he just was self-contained. He gave the impression that he was comfortable in himself and was not necessarily seeking something outside of what he had. That being said, he definitely howled a fair amount at different times, and all through the year, actually, not just during his mating season, which would have been January, February time period for wolves. And I do believe he really wanted and longed for and probably sought a mate, but he didn't leave the island to do that. He had a place there, and I think he was waiting for one to come along.
Mm-hmm. And one almost did.
Yes, and as you saw at the end of the film, one almost did. And it's still a very poignant aspect to this story. I find that this wolf appeared just last year at the time when it was actually not right it was after the mating season. But I suspect we think it was a young female, and I suspect that she was out doing what he had done, which is looking for a mate, and somehow she ended up right across from his islands, and she was actually even swimming in Cabro Bay, which is where he would probably have swum from when he went to the islands.
It's very Shakespearean.
Yeah, she never made it across, but you know, she did live for about 4 months after that in the Blenkinsop Valley, which is very close. It's part of suburban Victoria. So she was still hanging around, and I had hoped that he might eventually meet up with her.
So I mentioned that this story has a sad ending, in the sense that TAKAYA was killed by a trophy hunter in March, and I know I wept hard for that, and I know many others have. I'm kind of curious how you've been processing that loss.
It's been a really hard period. I've tried to understand the events that led up to it, and I did really seriously fluctuate between, you know, pretty intense anger at the situation, both at the conservation service that chose to not take him back to the islands, They chose to put him in a place that was actually filled with a lot of dangers for him as an old wolf, and he was very old for a wolf, and a lone wolf. He would have had a very hard time integrating into an existing pack. Where they put him was between two existing wolf packs. It was also in an area where there was trapping of wolves, active hunting of deer and wolves and elk, poachers. So, and also cars, and fairly close to a small community. So there, and did not have seals, which he was used to hunting. So it was not I don't think, a very thoughtful decision. And I wished they had taken him back to his islands. They said he left for a reason, and therefore they weren't taking him back. But they just said that. They have no idea why he left, and none of us do. And he may have left for a reason, or he may have gotten swept away in some of the strong winter currents and storms that happened around that time. Or he may have gone intentionally and then intended to go back to the island. So to not at least give him that chance and return him, I felt really angry. And then I also felt very despondent that we have in BC at the moment hunting regulations that actually seem to encourage hunters to kill wolves. And I don't know if technically this can be labeled a trophy hunt, because we still don't really know anything about the situation. Nothing has been released. But whether the person was actually out there looking for a wolf to take as a trophy or for TAKAYA, or whether they were just out in the woods and happened to have a hunting license and saw a wolf and decided to shoot it. Both of those are, in my mind, not an acceptable way for us to behave at the moment in our culture. Very little is known about the wolves, the populations of wolves on Vancouver Island. And they're currently undertaking a study to determine how many wolves there are and where they live. And so the fact that anyone with a hunting license can shoot without a special permit up to 3 wolves in a year, and in fact, hunters are encouraged to do that because they're considered to be vermin, and that they take the deer that the hunters want to also kill. It needs to be examined that we have this ability, and the fact that the person who did this is not called to account in any way, because it's currently a legal thing to have done.
It's also kind of telling that I think he kept TAKAYA's hide and skull. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, when people are discussing this, they sort of, argue over whether this was a trophy hunt, and the hunters will say, "Oh, it wasn't a trophy hunt. They just saw the wolf, and because of the encouragement to shoot wolves, that's what they did." But the intention of the hunter was obviously to keep the skin and the skull, because TAKAYA was skinned immediately. And his inner part was given to the province vet to do a necropsy, and then the hunter kept the skull and the hide. I've heard rumors that the Songhees are working out some kind of resolution with the hunters so that they would get all of TAKAYA back. The thought of TAKAYA being taxidermied and being in some collector's living room is really abhorrent to me. And I hope that that the hunter finds their way to do what is morally right and has integrity to it.
So, at this point, TAKAYA's story has gone global, thanks in part to your wonderful photos and advocacy. I'm just kind of wondering how you see TAKAYA's legacy continuing on into the future.
Yes, it's been absolutely amazing to me, the response that there has been globally to TAKAYA, to his story. There's something about him and his story that has really captured the hearts and the minds of a lot of people around the world in many different countries. And I didn't expect that. It wasn't something that I really thought would happen. Uh, I I think it speaks to the power of him as a sentient being, but I also think it speaks to the need that we have as people to connect to wild creatures that inhabit our earth. And Takaya, I think by telling his story or sharing his story, I gave people a glimpse into an individual animal that wasn't just a statistic or a part of a population. He had a character, and I think that that's very powerful. So my hope is that his death is not in vain, that he is able to trigger people to demand some change for the way that we treat wolves in our culture at the moment, and for the laws that allow us to just shoot a wolf if we want to, indiscriminately and recreationally. I think that's wrong. I have not got a lot of problem with hunting if someone is hunting deer for eating or for sustenance. I do have trouble with people just deciding to shoot wolves. And I don't think it is scientifically supported either, that is necessary to do that, to keep a balance. Hunters will argue that this is that they are the biggest conservationists in the world because they're helping to keep the populations in control. They have very little knowledge scientifically of even what those populations are, what the interactions are, and I think it's a very misguided mindset.
I also understand that that there's something exciting news coming this fall in terms of your work, that you'll be publishing a book, and I'm just kind of wondering if you can kind of give us a little bit of a sneak preview to what we can expect.
The I did write about Takaya, and it's a little bit about my story, a little bit about his story, mostly about his story. And it will have my photographs. It will tell the story of my learning about his life, and give glimpses into what his life was like. It's being published by Rocky Mountain Books, and it is due to be published at the end of September in 2020. Strangely and very sort of cosmically, I finished the last words and edits of my book the day that Takaya left the islands. And that is not an exaggeration. I literally, when I heard that he was in downtown Victoria, I was just finishing sitting at my computer, sending it away. So I'm excited about sharing it. It gives a little bit more detail about all the things I learned about him and what it was like trying to learn about him. I had a lot of challenges. I had to figure out how to navigate my boat by myself through pretty treacherous areas, rocks and currents, and trying to film and photograph at the same time. And there was just a lot of learning that for me went on as well. So I hope people will enjoy it and learn something from it about this remarkable creature that I feel I felt so honored to be able to get to know and to share.
Well, I really look forward to when that's released, and I hope that at that point we can all gather and kind of mourn Takaya's loss and also celebrate his life. So I think that's a really wonderful thing to look forward to, and I hope we can maybe get you back on the podcast at some point around then, just to touch base and see where things are at with that story.
Yeah, I'm hoping that when we're past the time of COVID, that there will be a chance for people to gather and celebrate the life of this wolf in a more collective way. And also, a really cool thing that's happening is that a local family has is commissioning a stone sculptor to do a sculpture of TAKAYA. And that is going to be, I think, quite special, and will be something that will be permanently there for people who want to sort of understand a little bit about what it was like to have this wolf living out there in those islands, and what we can learn from him and from his life.
Well, Cheryl, thank you so much. I really appreciate this conversation. Yeah, be well in these pandemic times, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you very much, Silas. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks again to Cheryl for this great conversation. If you want to find out more about her work or TAKAYA, I invite you to head onward to takayalonewolf.com or wildawake.com. You can also head over to awakenrelationship.com. I'll have those links in the show notes. You can also sign up for the newsletter. And if you enjoyed this episode, please hit subscribe. And I'd also super appreciate a review. So thanks for tuning into this episode of Awaken Relationship. And stay healthy, stay strong, and stay connected.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Awake in Relationship. If you liked what you heard, please click subscribe to get the latest show delivered fresh to your device, or sign up for our newsletter at awakeinrelationship.com. Sharing is caring.